Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for rising early, for having a quick lunch, or for staying up late to join our webinar on environmental neurotoxins and the impacts of fetal and early childhood exposure. This event is brought to you by the EcoWaste Coalition, an environmental NGO based in the Philippines, together with the International Pollutants Elimination Network, a global civil society network for a toxics-free future. We acknowledge and thank the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation for their continuing support to our mission and work. Before we proceed, let me thank some of the people behind this event. Leah Esquilio, the IPEN Regional Coordinator for Southeast and East Asia. Thank you for hosting the webinar, Leah. Tony Dison and Ryan Nurong of the EcoWaste Coalition, and Jerry Carretero of the Break Free from Plastic. Thank you for the technical support. Over 140 people from 23 countries have registered to join this webinar via Zoom, and we are able to reach out to more people via Facebook. Before I continue, please be reminded of the following. This webinar is being recorded and aired live on social media. In particular, this webinar is streaming on Facebook Live, courtesy of the EcoWaste Coalition and the Interfacing Development Interventions for Sustainability in the Philippines, the Consumers Association of Penang and Sahabat Alam Malaysia in Malaysia, and the Yayasan Gita Pertiwi in Indonesia. Kindly use the built-in Q&A feature if you have questions. And finally, for those who are participating via Facebook, please use the comment section for your questions. The EcoWaste Coalition and IPEN are jointly organizing this webinar as part of the International Lead Poisoning Prevention Week that is taking place from October 25 to 31 to raise awareness about the health effects of lead exposure and to drum up action toward the accelerated phase-out of lead paints through regulatory measures and other legal means. This week of action is spearheaded by the United Nations Environment Programme and the World Health Organization, the UN agencies co-leading the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint. Dr. Maria Neira of the World Health Organization has a special message for us and the global community. Dr. Neira is Director of the WHO Department of Environment, Climate Change, and Health. Let's hear from Dr. Neira.
The 8th International Lead Poisoning Prevention Week of Action seeks to raise awareness and promote action to address the human health effects of lead exposure, and especially in children. This global event is running every year, and this year it takes place from 25 to 31st October 2020. The whole week focuses on the urgency of eliminating lead in paint to prevent lead poisoning in children and workers. Despite those challenging times in the fight against COVID-19, every effort should be made to address the devastating human health effects of lead exposure, and again, especially for children. Lead affects our brain development in children, resulting in reduced IQ, changes in behavior, such as the shortening of attention span and increased antisocial behavior, as well as reducing educational level. And these effects continue as you grow into an adult and have negative long-term impacts on socio-economic status. And yet, lead paint is a preventable source of exposure to lead. Paints can be made without added lead. Safe paint exists. It is therefore time to ban lead paint. To date, only 75 countries have legally binding controls on lead paint. And certainly we applaud this achievement, but we want to see all countries worldwide to do the same. And that's why WHO urges all remaining countries, manufacturers, industry, and civil society to do everything possible to eliminate lead in paint. Globally, we need to stop the use of lead paint, and this can be done. We did it with the leaded gasoline that was eliminated, and now it is time to ban lead paint.
Thank you, Dr. Neira. For this webinar, we're so proud to be able to invite two distinguished colleagues from Canada and Sweden in the person of Dr. Bruce Lanphier and Dr. Sarah Brochet. Please allow me to introduce them. Bruce is a physician, a clinician scientist, and a professor. I first met him in 2016 in San Francisco, California, during the IPEN DTox3 Future Forum. For over 20 years, our presenter has studied the impact of toxic chemicals like lead and organophosphate pesticides on children's brain development and their implications for public health. Bruce has served on numerous scientific committees on environmental health issues impacting children, including the Executive Council on Environmental Health Issues for the American Academy of Pediatrics. Currently, he is the president of the International Society for Children's Health and the Environment, an organization that promotes high-quality research and advocates to protect children from toxic chemicals. Bruce has been producing short videos to enhance public understanding on how chemical toxins impact human health. He has yet to set foot in the Philippines and hope Bruce can drop by our country after the pandemic. Sarah, our other resource person, is a longtime advocate for the ban on lead in paints to eliminate lead poisoning risks, especially for children, women, and workers. I first met Sarah in 2011 as the International Pollutants Elimination Network, or IPEN, was preparing to embark on a 7-country lead paint elimination project in South and Southeast Asia. She joined IPEN after completing her master's degree in chemistry and her PhD in environmental science. She serves as science advisor for IPEN on a variety of chemical and waste issues. And she also acts as our manager for the IPEN's Global Lead Paint Elimination Campaign. Unlike Bruce, Sarah has visited the Philippines a few times. In one of her visits in 2012, we brought her to the session hall of the Manila City Council, where she was gratefully acknowledged by then Vice Mayor and now Mayor of the City of Manila, Isko Moreno. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Bruce Lanphier, a clinician scientist at the British Columbia Children's Hospital Research Institute and a professor in health sciences at Simon Fraser University in Canada. Bruce?
Good evening. I'm delighted to be with you tonight from British Columbia. Good evening. I'm delighted to be with you tonight from British Columbia. We've just had our first snow on the mountains across the way. And I wanted to begin by thanking you for all the work you do to protect kids from lead poisoning and other poisons in our environments. Tonight, I'm going to focus mostly on the impact of toxic chemicals on brain development, in particular, why a little poison is too much. And I'm going to focus on brain-based disorders in part because they are so common. In North America, we see about 1 in 10 children who meets the criteria for ADHD, about 1 in 6 for depression, 1 in 50 for conduct disorder, autism, and anxiety. So these problems are quite widespread, and we really haven't done a good job of trying to prevent them, identifying risk factors to understand what causes them and how to prevent them. But we do know that a number of things can impact brain development in some of these behavior problems, everything from the child's sex, nutrition, toxic stress, preterm birth, and in particular tonight we'll talk about toxic chemicals. But these don't act in isolation. For example, a child who is iron deficient or calcium deficient in their diet will absorb lead more readily. So we know that these can interact. The problem of poisoning from toxic chemicals was really first identified in a number of outbreaks around the world. In this particular case, an outbreak in Minamata Bay, Japan, led to an epidemic of children being disfigured and their brains were impacted by mercury exposure. Here you can see that the mother who's bathing her daughter looks normal, looks unscathed by mercury. But in fact, she was the mother was the one who ate the contaminated fish. And this woke us up to the idea that the developing child, the fetus, can be uniquely sensitive to toxicants. It also woke us up to the idea that the placenta does not act as a barrier to poisons. But those overt poisonings like Minamata disease or mining poisonings around La Arroya and Peru, those really are just the tip of the iceberg. And most of the disease that we see from children being exposed to toxic chemicals are not quite so obvious. They can become manifest in behavior problems like ADHD or other acting out behaviors, but they aren't quite as obvious as those massive poisonings. And so I'm going to talk more about some of these conditions that impact children across the board, but not quite from widespread poisoning that you might see in a mine or in Minamata Bay. And I'm going to do that by starting out by playing a video. And this video we put together as a way to try to help take the science and make it more accessible to the public, to parents. And in particular, we really wanted to get across the point that exceedingly low levels of exposure to toxic chemicals can have a big impact on children's development. And this is really in contrast to what I learned as I was being trained in medicine and public health, where we dismissed small exposures as being of little consequence. It's true, not all chemicals are bad, but toxic metals like lead and mercury are found in all of us. So are persistent toxins like PCBs and endocrine disruptors such as bisphenol A and flame retardants. We've been studying the impact of toxins on children for the past 30 years and reached the inescapable conclusion: little things matter. Toxins can have a lifelong impact on children. We've also discovered that extremely low levels of toxins can impact brain development. Let's take a look at the percent of children who are exposed to some of these toxins using a national study in the United States. To keep it simple, we'll use 100 children to represent all children. Mercury is found in 89% of children, primarily from eating large fish contaminated by pollution. Lead is detected in the blood of all children, regardless of race, income, or where they live. Over 80% of children are exposed to organophosphate pesticides, mostly from food. All children are exposed to PCBs, a persistent pollutant that was banned in the 70s, but will linger for generations. Bisphenol A, or BPA, is found in 96% of children. PBDEs, a type of flame retardant, are found in 100% of children. But these toxins don't occur in isolation. Children are exposed to many toxins and dozens of untested chemicals all the time. Let's take a look at the body burden of a typical child, one toxin at a time. If each marble represents 1 part per billion of a toxin, this figure represents the body burden of a typical child. 1 part per billion is deceptively small. It is only about 2 tablespoons of sugar in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. But chemicals can be biologically active, even at very low levels. chemical industry is trying to assure us that concentrations of these toxins are too small to cause harm. But chemicals designed by drug companies to alter behavior, like the prescribed dose of Ritalin, a drug commonly used to treat children with ADHD, is active at levels about the same or even lower than toxins found in the blood. Besides, a lot of studies have shown that some chemicals can be toxic, even at very low levels. As the body burden of PBDEs in pregnant women increases, the intellectual ability of their children decreases. Let's take a closer look. As the level of PBDEs in mother's blood increases from 10 to 100 parts per billion, the IQ scores of their children drop by about 5 points. We see a similar pattern with organophosphate pesticides. As the level of organophosphate pesticides in pregnant women increases from 10 to 75 parts per billion, the IQ scores of their children drop by about 5 points. In the 1960s, hundreds of children died from severe lead poisoning every summer. Since then, much lower levels of exposure have been shown to result in learning deficits and brain disorders like ADHD. In fact, the World Health Organization and other agencies agree there is no safe level of lead exposure. As the level of lead in children's blood increases from 0 to 100 parts per billion, IQ scores drop by about 6 points. In contrast, an increase from 100 to 200 parts per billion results in an IQ drop of 2 more points. An increase from 200 to 300 parts per billion results in an IQ drop of another point. The impact of toxins on the developing brain is permanent. Children who are more heavily exposed to toxins won't reach the same peak cognitive ability as those who have lower exposures. These studies show that there is no safe level of exposure. They also indicate that the way we regulate toxins, which assumes there is a safe level, fails to protect children. The chemical industry argues that the effect of toxins on children is subtle and of little consequence, but that's misleading. Little shifts in children's IQ scores have a big impact on the number of children who are challenged or gifted. Let's go back to our original sample of 100 children and look at a typical distribution of IQ scores. Most of us have IQ scores that fall between 85 and 115 points. Only 2.5% of children have an IQ above 130, which is considered gifted. There are about 6 million children in this group. On the other end of the distribution, another 2.5% of children have an IQ below 70, which is considered challenged. The impact of exposure to a toxin like lead causes a 5-point drop in IQ. This shift results in a 57% increase in the number of children that are challenged, from 6 million to 9.4 million. There's a corresponding decrease in the number of children that are gifted, from 6 million to 2.4 million. Little shifts matter. The impact of exposure to another toxin, like flame retardants, results in a further increase in the number of children who are challenged, from 9.4 million to over 11 million. There is a further decrease in the number of gifted children. Although many, or even most, chemicals are harmless, the cumulative impact of exposures to 3 or 4 toxins is overwhelming to imagine. In Canada and the United States, chemicals are used in consumer products and released into the environment before they are tested for toxic effects. By allowing children to be exposed to toxins or chemicals of unknown toxicity, we are unwittingly using our children as part of a massive experiment. But it doesn't have to be this way. Like the European Union, we could require industry to prove that the chemicals they use aren't toxic before they enter the market. How can we avoid exposures to toxins or chemicals of unknown? So what we've begun to learn over the past 20 or 30 years is that there is no safe level for many of the most widely disseminated and well-studied toxic chemicals like lead and some pesticides and air pollution and PBDEs. This contrasts with the way we regulate toxic chemicals today. We assume for non-carcinogens that there are safe levels or thresholds. But what if there isn't? What we've begun to realize is that we have dramatically underestimated the impact of these toxic chemicals on our health. I'll provide a couple of examples. First, it's important to recognize that we didn't evolve with levels that are this high, even for natural things like lead. In this picture, you can see three cartoons. The one on the child on the far right, each of those dots represents 40 micrograms of lead in bone. The child on the far right is a lead poisoned, overtly poisoned child. In the middle, that was a typical child in the 1960s in North America, probably more typical 1980s for many parts of Africa, China, and Southeast Asia, where industrialization happened later. But the key is this child over on the far left, where there's only one dot. That represents a pre-industrial child. So even despite the decline in blood levels that we've seen over the past 5 or 6 decades, we are still 10 to 100 times more heavily exposed than our pre-industrial ancestors. So the levels that we're exposed to aren't low. One of the things that's really striking is the ban that on smoking in public places that we've seen. And this has been replicated in many countries around the world. And what this study from Scotland found was following the ban on smoking in public places among non-smoking pregnant women, they saw a 15% reduction in preterm birth from secondhand smoke reduction. They saw a 25% reduction in very preterm birth, that is, children born before 34 weeks of age. That's striking. We have no drugs that even come close to reducing preterm birth by 25%. And yet the majority of physicians that I talk to aren't even aware of this kind of evidence. Now, if we look at the seminal study in childhood lead poisoning, which was done by Herb Needleman back in the 1970s, what he found was that as tooth lead levels increased, children experienced a number of problems that will make it difficult for them to succeed in a school setting or in a workplace, in many workplaces. They were less able to follow directions as their tooth lead levels increased. They were more impulsive. They were less persistent in the work and less dependable. What we now think of all of these behaviors as ADHD type behaviors. And what we found in a national survey in the United States is if you look at children from the lowest third, on average, they only experience about one ADHD symptom compared to children in the top third of blood lead levels. Now, the difference is only 2 ADHD symptoms. A typical child with ADHD has about 15 symptoms. So does it really matter when you have an increase in ADHD type symptoms from 1 to 3 in groups of children? Well, look at what happens here at the tail. That shift led to an increase in the percent of children in the population going from 5% in the low lead group to 13% in the high lead group. But we can also see that some toxic chemicals interact. So when we looked at children who were not exposed to high levels of lead and whose mothers did not smoke when they were pregnant with them, on average, those children only had about one ADHD type symptom. For children who had both tobacco exposure and high levels of lead, when I say high levels, I'm only talking about over 1.7 microgram per deciliter. These are not high levels. We saw an increase in the prevalence of ADHD jump up from 4% in the low lead and unexposed tobacco group to 24% in the children who had both exposures. That means 1 out of 4 children met criteria for ADHD if they had both of those exposures. We recently completed a study that looked at brain imaging, the architecture of the brain in over 9,000 children in the United States. And what we found is that those children who lived in neighborhoods with a high risk of lead exposure, based largely on age of housing, we saw that as their risk increased, we saw smaller brain size. And we also saw reduced cognition, but predominantly in the low income group. So that either means that children who grow up in an impoverished setting have less resiliency, or it may be that the children who lived in older housing who were wealthier were not exposed to as much lead. In either case, what we saw is that the kinds of behaviors like ADHD and the diminished IQ seem to have a basis in the way lead changes the brain, changes the size of the brain, and it changes the thinning of the cortex. It makes it less functional. Now, we also know that lead doesn't only impact the brain. There was a study out of Bristol, England, that showed that pregnant women with a blood level of 5 microgram per deciliter or higher were almost 2 times more likely to give birth too soon, before 37 weeks gestation or duration of pregnancy. And of course, that is preterm birth has implications both for mortality in the first year of life, infant mortality, as well as long-term complications. Now, we focus mostly on the brain today, and for children, for toxic chemicals like lead, we often focus on children, but we completed a study a few years ago, and this is based upon a series of other studies that were done showing that lead is a causal risk factor for hypertension and coronary heart disease. By the year 2008, studies had already shown that in laboratory animals, if you dose animals with lead, it enhances the development of atherosclerosis, narrowing of the arteries by inactivating nitric oxide, inhibiting the repair of the endothelial lining, the lining on the inside of arteries, impairing angiogenesis, or the growth of new blood vessels, and promoting thrombosis or clots. That's a classic. All of those are the classic hallmarks of arteriosclerosis or atherosclerosis and coronary heart disease. And yet, despite all this evidence, no studies have calculated the number of deaths from cardiovascular disease attributable to lead exposure. So I'm going to show you a short video that shows you what we found in the United States. Lead is also a risk factor for coronary heart disease. That's when your heart is slowly or suddenly suffocated by an obstruction of the arteries feeding the heart. In a national study, we found that deaths increased sharply at blood levels below 50 parts per billion, the level considered safe. There was no threshold or safe level. If we let the narrowing of this coronary artery represent the risk of dying from heart disease, you can see that most of the narrowing occurs below 50 parts per billion. Lead accounts for about 185,000 deaths every year. That makes lead the leading cause of fatal heart attacks in the United States. So what we found was that lead is a leading but largely ignored cause of coronary heart disease, which is now the leading cause of death worldwide. As countries like those in Southeast Asia and Africa and China industrialized, coronary heart disease, hypertension became the leading cause of death worldwide. And yet still we focus mostly on blaming people for their lifestyle choices, like what they eat. We don't think about air pollution or lead exposure as causing these conditions, but indeed they do. I want to end with a quote, one of my favorite quotes these days. "We can't live in a state of perpetual doubt," Daniel Kahneman said. "So we make up the best story possible, and we live as if the story were true." We've lived out of this story that we're going to use technology to solve our health problems. We've lived out of a story that 50 years ago, as chronic diseases began to increase, that we needed to find ways to treat those diseases, to prevent suffering. All of that made sense 50 years ago. But what we've learned over the past 50 years is that many of the chronic diseases that plague us, that kill us, are caused by chronic exposures to toxic chemicals. These are things that, as individuals, we can't solve by ourselves. We need our governments to step in, which is why the work you're doing is so important. Now we know 50 years later, whether it's problems learning in school, whether it's behavior problems, whether it's dementia, whether it's kidney disease. There's so many of the problems today that plague us that we can attribute back to problems like air pollution and lead exposure and other toxic chemicals. And so the work you're doing is so critical to help people begin to grapple with this new story that we've got to deal with. It's not enough to study genetics. It's not enough to look for new cures, because I think when we stop and ask ourselves, most of us would prefer never to have the disease in the first place. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Bruce, for that thought-provoking 20-minute presentation. I believe your presentation has provided our participants with new insights on the effects of ubiquitous but insidious toxins on brain development and human health. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. And if you're tuned in via Facebook, please use the comment section. If possible, please indicate your name and the country where you are from. Our next presenter is no other than Dr. Sarah Brochet, Science Advisor and Manager of the IPEN's Global Lead Paint Elimination Campaign. Sarah?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me in this brief overview of IPEN's global campaign to eliminate lead paint. I will tell you a little bit of how it all started, what has happened so far, and some useful campaign strategies and lessons learned. First, let's start with a bit of history. 20 years ago, very few people thought about the potential availability of lead paint in the market in low and middle income countries, despite scientific publications showing that this was clearly the case. However, in 2007, our NGO colleagues at Toxics Link conducted a study showing that paint with high levels of lead was widely available for home use in India. And when this information was brought to the rest of the IPEN network, a 10-country study was conducted with similar results. It was clear that global efforts were needed to eliminate lead paint, and IPEN's global campaign was initiated. This information was then brought to the global policy arena, which catalyzed the formation of the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint, hosted by WHO and UNEP, and a global goal of lead paint elimination by the year 2020 was adopted. And thanks to all the hard work of IPENers all over the world, the campaign has had some really great achievements so far. A tremendous amount of data has been generated that clearly shows that all countries must act to ban all lead paint. We see that NGO campaigns are having a big impact that actually leads to new regulations in many countries, which is a very challenging task, as I'm sure you all know. I also want to highlight that the first third-party certification program for lead-safe paint was established through the campaign. This certification helps consumers choose paint that is verified to be safe from lead. So how do we actually get to these achievements? I'm now going to go through some of the major components and strategies of IPEN's global campaign. We have commitments in global policy arenas from more than 140 countries to eliminate lead paint globally. But the question is, how does that commitment get implemented in the national context, and how can lead paint elimination be made a national priority? The key to a successful campaign in your country, and for any issue apart from lead paint also, is to have a strategy that is developed to create change. So first of all, it's important to know what you want to achieve. In this case, the end goal is to eliminate lead paint completely, with a key step of the adoption and enforcement of strong regulations. It is also important to think about which the key stakeholders are in your country. Our experience is that policymakers and the local paint industry are important in all countries, But you may also have health professionals, consumer organizations, or other stakeholders that are strategic to work with. And also in engaging with these stakeholders, it is important to know what you want them to do and what motivates them to act, and build your strategies around that. We have seen that 3 key strategies are useful in most countries around the world. First, to make the problem relevant for your country. This could be through country data on lead in paint, but there is also other ways. Secondly, it's important to make consumers aware that lead paint is on the market and the hazard of that, especially to children. They will then start asking both for safe paint and for regulations to protect them. And thirdly, by elevating the issue of lead paint, industry stakeholders are going to react. And this could be either since they are made aware of the hazard and want to do the right thing, but it could also simply be to protect their brand reputation. Either way, when they start phasing out lead from their paint, they are likely to support and even demand regulations on lead paint to get an even playing field for everyone. These 3 taken together will create political will in a country and an ability for the government to prioritize this issue and act. So let's first look into awareness raising. A key message of your awareness raising is that if there is no enforced regulation on lead paint in your country, you will have lead paint on the market. National data showing this is very useful and it's an effective tool, but there is actually no need for countries to wait even without that data. If we look at the results from all the studies that we have now, there is already clear justification for all countries to adopt lead paint regulations. Another very effective way of highlighting the importance of lead paint regulations for the country is to show real-life examples of use. And one such example is the studies on lead paint on playground equipment conducted last year, but also showing the presence of lead paint, for example, in schools and on children's products have also been shown to be a very effective tool. So looking at what happened in Indonesia when this study on playgrounds was released, the governor of Jakarta immediately reacted by announcing a plan to ban the use of lead-based paints on children's playgrounds. This shows how quickly you can get the attention of policymakers with the right strategies. Even you, of course, have to follow up and make sure that they follow through on their commitments. Some other examples of country-specific actions are based on a report in India and South Korea that highlighted both the need for enforcing existing regulations, but also to make sure regulations include all types of paint. I also included the third example here to show how valuable progressive industry partners can be, who can speak from actual experience and with credibility on, for example, the business case for eliminating lead paint. But even if you don't have any country-specific information or exciting new studies, you still have a very good position to do awareness raising, since you have the most compelling message there is. Lead paint harms children and is most likely available on the market in your country if there is no enforced regulation. This message alone is in many cases enough for getting the attention of stakeholders. In your awareness raising efforts, media events can be a very useful and effective tool, since in this way you can get widespread coverage by conducting activities that are designed to be attractive to media. For example, with good photo opportunities and adorable children. It's of course important to make sure that the activity is appropriate in your country context and that you have made sure that, for example, any children that participate are doing so with the permission of their parents. And as I mentioned before, another important strategy is the engagement with local paint industry. I have added a statement from the Global Paint Industry Association here, supporting the elimination of lead paint. But in a national context, the local industry is probably more important. But at the same time, support from the global industry can be an important talking point when you reach out to your national industry. Usually in NGO campaigns, industry tends to be more of a target than an ally, and often for very good reasons. But when it comes to lead paint, progressive industry allies can actually make your campaign both stronger and more successful. Some manufacturers and national industry associations are even partners to the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint. So it's important to think about also this aspect in your country and how you can go about it. The initial strategy I would suggest is to reach out to local industry to have an open conversation, educate them about the hazard of lead paint, and try to understand them better. Do they produce lead paint or not? If so, will they change? If you have actual data on their paint, that's a very useful starting point. But you can also approach them even without that data, just to have that conversation. And the best outcome you can get is for them to become champions of the effort to ban lead paint in your country. If they both support and advocate for new regulations, that will certainly help in getting the ear of the government. And there are, of course, manufacturers that are not progressive and will not phase out lead paint, even if we typically don't see open opposition. For those, adopted regulations are typically the only solution. One more thing that is important to know is that it's actually possible for all manufacturers to phase out lead from their paint production, whatever they say. This has been shown by companies of all sizes around the world. Alternatives to lead paint are available, and the know-how of paint reformulation exists. However, smaller companies may have some obstacles, and that includes getting access to lead-free raw materials for the right price, but also advice on how to best go about the reformulation. One way to overcome this is to connect with different suppliers of the lead-free raw materials you're looking for and see what price that can be negotiated, as well as what support they can get during the process. Paint reformulation can take a bit of time, since it includes a certain amount of trial and error to get the properties of the new paint right. This is also why the best approach in the country typically is to put regulations in place with a grace period before coming into force, so that all companies can and must do the reformulation at the same time. And to get a regulation adopted, you of course also need to engage with the policymakers who can make this happen. And here NGOs play a very important role to keep the issue high up on their agenda. We have seen that the most successful approach in a country is usually to gather the key stakeholders from industry, civil society, and any others together with the policymakers. In this way, there can be open dialogue from the start about the way forward to an adopted regulations, and also discuss issues that come up. And this is also an approach that is promoted by the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint. The UN Environment Programme has published a model law and guidance for regulating lead paint, which can be a very useful tool for countries. And this helps with describing all aspects and provisions that needs to be considered to make a regulation effective. It also promotes adoption of a total lead limit of 90 parts per million for all types of paint, which actually mirrors the strictest regulation in place in the world today. In addition to just regulating lead in new newly produced paint. You might also want to discuss other provisions, such as occupational exposure and what to do with legacy paint that is already on the walls. And finally, just some quick conclusions. Here I have tried to show the three components of a successful campaign and the different steps for each group of stakeholders that would contribute to a new lead paint regulation. So it starts with civil society and the efforts to raise awareness and make eliminating lead paint an urgent country priority. It also includes efforts to engage with industry to make them start phasing out lead from their paint production and support adoption of the new regulation. Finally, it includes steps for encouraging and enabling policymakers to act. I want to end this presentation by emphasizing that NGOs are the key to catalyzing change in the country, both on lead paint, but of course on other issues as well. And for lead paint, this is really clear from the almost 50 countries that have adopted lead paint regulations or are in the process of doing so. NGOs have a unique position in that they base their action on what is good for the public and can act much more freely than the government or most other entities. So I therefore want to conclude by encouraging everyone to see what actions needs to be taken on lead paint in your country. And of course, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me or anyone else in the IPEN team if you want to discuss further. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I wish you a lead-safe rest of the week.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for the very important information that you have shared regarding the urgency of eliminating lead paint, a preventable source of childhood lead exposure. Sarah, are you already with us? Do you mind turning on your video? We'll now proceed to the question and answer section of the webinar, and we thank all of you who have shared your questions, and we'll try to respond to some of them within the available time. The first question is from Mageswari Sangaralingam. She's from the Consumers Association of Penang. Here's her question. Many families are living in poverty and in contaminated environments. Are the impacts of known brain poison such as lead worse for children who suffer from hunger and malnutrition? Why? And what interventions are needed to protect them from these poisons? May we hear from you, Bruce?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, children who are poor and have poor nutrition are at higher risk for a few reasons. One is if a child is iron deficient or has inadequate amounts of calcium in their diet, they will more readily absorb lead because lead mimics those other metals and how they get into the body. So that's the first way that children who are poor or who have a poor diet are at higher risk. Another way is that oftentimes these various toxic chemicals concentrate in the neighborhoods where poor children live. And so in addition to lead, a child may be exposed to higher levels of highway traffic or secondhand smoke or pesticides or all of these things. And they can each add up. And in some cases, we can see that one toxic chemical can magnify the harm or injury from another one. So those are the main reasons that immediately come to mind.
Thank you for that, Bruce. Our next question is from Eileen Lucero of the Ecowaste Coalition in the Philippines. Her question: we know that lead is a toxicant affecting multiple body systems, especially the brain and the central nervous system. Can you enlighten us more on the science as to why lead is also considered an endocrine disrupting chemical, or EDC? What are the effects if lead is able to interfere with the body's hormones? Bruce?
Yeah, a couple things. We don't always consider it an endocrine disrupting chemical, but there is evidence that lead can increase stress, and that when stress and lead act together, they again can magnify each other. There's some evidence, it hasn't been looked at thoroughly, but there's some evidence that lead can disrupt the thyroid hormone, and it can also lead to stunting of children. They become shorter if they've been lead exposed. And that may be a function of endocrine disruption. It could also have something to do with calcium metabolism. But those are some of the ways. There may be other ways as well.
Thank you, Bruce. The next question is from Nepal, from Ram Charitra Sa of Cephed. What percentage of leaded paint contributes to the global blood lead level and to the global burden disease scenario, if you know, Bruce?
Well, there probably isn't any safe level of lead that we've been able to come up with. And as I described in the video, um, it looks like down as low as we can measure it, we see decrements in children's intellectual abilities and increases the risk of adults dying from coronary heart disease. So oftentimes what happens is we find out levels that are achievable, that we think will be better than the old standards. So now in most countries that are keeping up to date with the science, it will be below 100 parts per billion in paint, as I recall. Uh, but it again is oftentimes dictated by what is thought to be feasible to achieve.
Thank you, Bruce. Our next question is from a journalist here in Manila, Bruce. Her name is Jasmine Romero from ABS-CBN. Her questions are, how do you detoxify children since they are already exposed to lead and other chemicals? And can you reverse the effects? Second, how is the Philippines dealing with the problem? And third, do you have studies that represent the Philippines and exposure of Filipino children to these toxic chemicals? Thank you.
I'll leave the second question to the experts on the panel besides me. Um, we don't have a drug that will reverse some of the symptoms of IQ deficits or problems with academic abilities or behavior problems. The drugs that we have, they're called chelating drugs, will prevent a child who's very heavily poisoned from dying, which is a great thing, but it doesn't reverse the damage to the brain at lower levels. So those chelating agents might be of benefit to adults. It might prevent them progressing to renal disease, renal failure, or coronary heart disease, but they aren't useful in children. And then there is a study, as I recall, from the Philippines by Solon, Solon, that showed very consistent decrements in children's intellectual ability. And if the child had lower folate, the problem was worsened. So folate might be protective. That was one study where they found that to be true. And again, I'll leave the question about how the Philippines is dealing with the problem to the other experts on the panel or on the uh, webcast here.
Thank you, Bruce. Jasmine, for your information, there are participants from the healthcare sector present in this webinar. I think Tony can provide you with their contact details later so they can respond to your question personally. The next question is from Romel Ariola. He's from the Action on Smoking and Health, ASH. Thank you for your compelling presentation, Bruce. That's from Romel. I'd like to know if there's anything of concern for nickel and chromium exposure that has come upon any of your studies. Since we already have data that lead and nickel are present in vape, aerosol, in e-cigarettes, there's a study now that linked nickel and chromium in heating coils of e-cigarettes to severe lung injury, which may have been responsible for the strings of deaths in the US that did not involve the addition of cannabis oil. That's his question, Bruce.
Yes, thank you for the question, Ramel. I have not kept up with that study. I haven't read that study. We do know that nickel can cause a hypersensitivity, um, but I haven't particularly read these studies, so I can't answer that question. I apologize.
That's all right, Bruce. Our next question is from Glenn Imata. He's from Noburn, Pilipinas. Is burning or incinerating materials painted with lead paint increases the toxicity of the emissions of waste treatment or waste incineration facility? If so, what percentage of increase or how worse? That's from Glenn.
Yes. So it I don't think it makes it more toxic per se, but if you burn lead paint or other leaded materials, electronic waste, for example, it will vaporize the lead, and so you will potentially inhale more, breathe in more, but also perhaps ingest more. So it can lead to higher rates of poisoning if that increases the overall exposure. And so everything from how we take off paint from inside our homes, you don't want to burn it off because that will increase exposure to the person doing the work and certainly will contaminate the inside of the home. The same token, you want to be very careful if there are fires of old houses or bridges uh, that oftentimes were painted with very high concentrations of lead. Those can be toxic because as the material burns, it will release off uh, inhalable lead that at those levels can be toxic.
Thank you. We have a question from Charmaine Miku Oblifias. Is there a website that we can recommend to parents of our patients where they could check the lead content in common toys?
And I think that's a question for Sarah, maybe.
Yeah. And probably just a quick reply. Uh, there are websites that provide information about recalled toys, and that can be a good reference. Perhaps you can try visiting the websites of Healthy Canadians, Product Recalls Australia, as well as the EU RAPEX, the Rapid Alert System for non-food items. Thank you, Charmaine. Uh, is Sarah with us already? Leah, would you know?
Not yet.
Not yet. Uh, Bruce, there's a question here from Chinky Pelino Golye from Southern Philippines. She's from an NGO called EDIS. We understand that lead paint has been banned in developed countries for decades. Why is it that the effects of lead paint remain to be a significant issue in some affluent countries, particularly in the US? What can we from developing countries learn from developed countries in terms of addressing the toxic legacy of lead paint?
Yeah, that's a great question. And probably the most important thing is to prevent more lead paint being applied because once you put it on material, on housing, on bridges, once it's on streets, it's going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, to get rid of it. So that's the first thing. And that's why what uh, uh, that's why the work of IPEN and other groups is so important, is to stop using it in the first place. Then the next step is to try to identify what the major sources are in any community or country and begin to target those sources, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in spices, whether it's in paint, whether it's in certain types of gasoline like aviation gasoline that can still be a problem, and then to begin to target each one of those to protect their citizens.
Thank you, Bruce. And I would like to add that early action to eliminate the manufacture, distribution, sale, and use of lead-containing paints in all paint categories, I think will have the potential of avoiding legacy problems very significantly. Lead paint issues will remain in all countries where leaded paints are still being manufactured, distributed, and used. It is therefore necessary to create increased awareness on the hazards of lead paint and lead dust. When lead painted surfaces are disturbed or removed. Here in the Philippines, while we have phased out lead in paint, we have yet to address the problem with legacy paint, especially at homes, in schools, and other places frequented with children. We have suggested to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to come up with mandatory guidelines that will guide renovators on proper handling of lead-painted surfaces. There's one more question, I think, Bruce, in the chat box. This is from Miss Tessa Oliva. She's from Miriam College here in Quezon City. Lead seems to be well controlled in the Philippines. Right now, use of iPads and cell phones expose children to this equipment. In fact, the Department of Education, because of the pandemic, is going into online distance learning. As a result, most students use cell phones and iPads. Are there dangers or health issues that could be caused from exposure or use of this digital equipment? Bruce?
This again is not another, this is another area I'm not an expert in. There, you can find some credible studies on a website and a group called Environmental Health Trust, which is based in Washington, D.C., and in some of the books that Deborah Davis has written. There certainly is enough evidence to be concerned. Of course, we have become so dependent on these technologies that it's going to be very challenging to both study their impact and figure out, because they're constantly changing, what the hazards are. But I'm not an expert in that, and so I would refer you to Environmental Health Trust as a source of information.
Thank you, Bruce. Are there more questions from our participants? It's now almost midnight in British Columbia, and if there are no more comments or questions, I would like to request Bruce for his parting words, if any.
Well, once again, I just want to thank all of you for the work you're doing, for taking up this task. Oftentimes, it feels like a battle. There's been a lot of progress over the past 50 years, but it only comes about when dedicated citizens, parents, like all of you, take time from your day to find ways to learn about the problems, to develop regulations, to lobby, to work with your local leaders. Uh, I used to think that if you just produced the science, if you just conducted a study, that was enough and things would happen. And what I've learned is it takes thousands of people committing their lives over many years for us to make progress in areas like lead poisoning prevention. So I want to thank all of you for your work. And Manny, I want to thank you and your colleagues for inviting me to participate in this webinar.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We're really happy that you can make it. You did not manage to travel to the Philippines, but we managed to bring your message to the broader audience. Thank you. And we really hope that after the pandemic, you can consider uh, traveling to the Philippines.
I would love to
Yeah.
do it, Manny. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. For the concluding remarks, let us hear from Leah Esquilio, the IPEN Regional Coordinator for Southeast and East Asia. Leah?
Thank you, Manny. So first of all, sincere thanks to Bruce and Sarah for joining us in the webinar. We know that the timing of our webinar is not optimum for them. As Manny mentioned, it's almost midnight now in Bruce's place, and very early in the morning for Sarah. Perhaps that's why she wasn't able to join us live during the question and answer. But many thanks to Bruce and Sarah for preparing actually their presentations way in advance and for joining us in our webinar. Very informative information. Thank you, Bruce and Sarah. Sincere thanks as well to Manny for moderating our webinar today. We really timed it this week because we are celebrating, we are commemorating the International Lead Prevention and Poisoning Week of Action. So this is a very important time, not just for the Philippines, but for the global push against lead poisoning. So thank you, Manny, for being with us. And finally, of course, thank you to all participants. We are very happy that many of you found time to be with us this afternoon. So thank you for joining us. We hope that you found the inputs helpful, both in your work or areas of interest. Thank you so much. We would like to request, please, after the webinar, there will be an evaluation popping up in your browser. Do please answer it's just few questions so that we would have feedback from you to be able to improve our future webinars, detox sessions, and online discussions. Finally, also, we would like to remind you, for those who have not yet signed up for our regional virtual conference beginning next week, we will also have exciting discussions about citizen science in Southeast and East Asia here in our region. So do register if you have not done so. And don't forget that our very first session would be next Wednesday. So do sign up for that. Meanwhile, again, thank you so much again for joining us. We hope you found everything useful, and please do take care and keep safe wherever you are. Back to you, Manny.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hope to see you again, and please remain healthy, safe, and strong as we all face the challenges of COVID-19 and the climate crisis. Marami pong salamat. Mabuhay.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you all. Be well.